So, as Vivek said, I'm an exams academic support manager based in Europe, and a lot of my work involves the teachers in the French universities, the engineering schools, and the Grande École, where Ielts is quite important because their students either need a certification of their English level to graduate, or they want to take part in international student exchanges. In the next hour, we're going to talk a little bit about learner autonomy, and I'm also going to show you some of the online resources that we have for Ielts. So I'd like to get a sort of idea about who's here. So if you are currently working with students preparing for Ielts, or teachers who are preparing students for Ielts, could I ask you to put your hand up? You're very welcome. And if you think you might be working with students or teachers related to Ielts in the future, could you put your hand up? Oh, that looks better. And if you think you're just here for general interest, could you put your hand up? Okay, and you are all very welcome. So, to keep you awake, I'm going to keep making you put your hands up. So, I'd like you now to put your hand up if you have one of these devices. Do you have one of these? Or one of these? Keep your hand up if you've got them all. One of those. One of those. One of those. If you're very lucky, you've got an IWB or some kind of interactive board in your classroom. Must have one of those. Maybe have one of those. And what about your students? Could you just put your hand up if your students have at least one of those things? Okay, because I think now with so much technology in our lives and in our students' lives, myself as a technological immigrant, I think we need to become familiar with it because it's part of our students' lives, and if we can make it part of their language learning as well, seems like the sensible thing to do. The first thing I'd like you to do is to talk to the person next to you about how autonomous your students are about their learning of English. So could you talk to someone else, a couple of minutes, tell them, are your students self-directed in their learning or teacher-directed in their learning? And now, to get an idea about what you've been saying, could you put your hands out like this, please? You are the balance. Now, if your students are self-directed in their learning, can you please go like this? And if they are teacher-directed, please go like this. Thank you. So, just a bit of fun to keep you awake at night, in the evening. So, next question is, why do we want our learners to be autonomous? As teachers, we certainly don't want to do ourselves out of a job. So could you again talk to the person next to you and see if you can come up with one or two reasons why we want our students to be autonomous learners? I'm not going to ask you for feedback, but please feel free to save your comments for the last 5 or 10 minutes. Some of the reasons that I think we do want our learners to be autonomous is because then they take control of the learning, they take responsibility for the learning, and this, in fact, gets them involved in the learning process. I'd like to quote David Little's 3 principles of involvement, which is to engage the learners in the planning, in the monitoring, and in the implementing and evaluating of their learning reflection and their target language use. It also allows them, because they're taking control of their learning, it does have potentially an impact on their motivation. Obviously, we all have busy lives, so what the hours of class time may not be enough for them. And many people have other commitments, whether they have families or they're working and studying at the same time. So allowing them to have some autonomy means that they can fit it in around the rest of their life because it's more flexible. And also, people have different learning styles, whereas learning autonomously allows the students to learn in their own way. As teachers, we try to balance that in the classroom, but there's perhaps limitations to what we can do. The next question is, what do the learners need in order to be autonomous? And I think some of the key things is they need to be able to see their goals and objectives, which, if you've got students who are preparing for Ielts, those are usually pretty clear to them because they need a specific band score, because they want to go and study a specific course somewhere else, but also helping them to, you know, have short-term goals, again, can be very motivating. I think they need a structure. I don't think you can say to your students, there's all those online resources out there, just go and improve your English, because there's too much and we get lost. We don't know where to look, what to do. They also need to be able to measure their progress, and they need to be motivated. But because self-study, they're involved in the decision-making, it may affect their intrinsic motivation, and so they may do better if they are involved in making decisions about it. I'm going to tell you a little bit now about some of the resources that are available for... No, I'm not. I'm going to ask you to do one more task. Sorry. Okay, so this obviously is a classroom, and I'd like you to, again, talk to the person next to you about what a classroom's good for. I would argue that classroom teaching is absolutely essential. I'm not saying here there's online resources, we don't need the classroom anymore. But if we're looking for what should we be doing in the classroom and what should our learners be doing on their own, what are the key points about the classroom? Yep. Could I ask you to just talk together, and then at the end we'll have a sort of more open session, if that's okay. Sorry. If I could stop you there. Maybe we could take some feedback. You were saying that classrooms are good for discussions. Did anyone else come up with other things that classrooms are particularly good for? Speaking skills, definitely. Peer support, live interaction with peers, definitely. Mentor support from the teacher. Confidence building, listening skills. So we definitely are still needed. And I think also when you're first introducing something, presenting the main points, obviously the classroom is the place where you can make sure that the students have understood and have what they need to know. As you said, speaking and listening, that cooperation and mutual learning that takes place when there's a class of students. I think the classroom is a safe learning environment, and it provides a framework for their learning. We've looked at the classroom. Now we're going to look at online, learning online. Could you again just talk to each other for 1 or 2 minutes? What's this good for? And then I'll ask for some feedback. If I could stop you there, would somebody like to share with us what you've been saying? Yes? Exactly, yeah. The students can work at their own pace. They have access to a huge body of information. Yes. Definitely flexibility. They can do it at home, yes. It saves time. Okay, so there's lots of good reasons to encourage it. They're autonomous. They can focus on what they need to study, which may not be the case if you've got 20, 30, 40 students. It's difficult to meet the needs of every single student. Fits with their lifestyles, as you said. It can also reinforce the classroom learning, and it helps us as teachers. I think in any class, we've got students with different strengths and weaknesses, and this is by encouraging them to do specific work online. It helps us to deal with those mixed abilities that we deal with on a daily basis. I think the ideal would be the virtuous circle, whereby we have the classroom practice and the classroom analysis, which then feeds into online further practice, which then comes back into the classroom, and it's part of a cycle of learning. I'm going to show you now some of the resources that are available. Now, the first thing I'm going to show you is Road to IELTS. Now, this is online material. It comes in different forms. There are 10 hours of it which are free on the Take IELTS website. Then there are 30 hours of online material which is given free to every candidate who registers with the British Council for IELTS. And the final sort of version of it, if you like, is a full 120-hour version of Road to IELTS, which is designed for institutions. And where I work in France, some of the grandes écoles, like Sciences Po, which is the most prestigious political science university in France, they've taken the institutional version of Road to IELTS for all their students. So their students have access to 120 hours of specific IELTS preparation material. And the wonderful thing about the institutional version is that it comes with a teacher tracking system, which allows the teacher to see which exercises their students have done, which exercises they're doing well on, and which exercises they're having more trouble with, which then allows us as teachers to focus what we do on the classroom more exactly on the students' needs. And if you'd like to know more about the institutional version of IELTS, please come and talk to Vivek and my other colleagues on the IELTS stand. So let's have a look at it. So this is the candidate version of Road to IELTS, which is free for candidates. And as you can see, like the IELTS test, it's divided into the 4 skill areas: the reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And within each area, there are different zones. So let's have a look at the reading. So the first thing that they have is they have starting out. So they have a choice here. They could read the information as an e-book. They could download it and print it out, or they could watch a video, because there are people who like to read online. I'm not one of them. There are people who prefer to hold something in their hand when they're reading, so that's an option. And there are visual learners who perhaps would rather watch a video to get the information that they need. And this gives them it gives them the key facts about that paper of the IELTS test and some advice. The next section is the advice and tutorials section, and I'd like to just show you this in the writing. So here we have a number of tutorials that the students can watch, and what I do with this is I watch it myself and I make some notes of the advice that's given in a specific tutorial, and then ask the students to go away, look at it at home. They've got a set of questions which will help them to pick out the key points, and then come back to the class and talk about what they've learned. Because again, rather than the teacher standing there and giving their students, this is the advice that you need for the IELTS test, It's the students coming back into the classroom and talking about the advice that they've heard about. So it's more real. They've got ownership of it. So that's one zone. And then we have the practice zone. So let's stay in the writing. And if you look at the practice zone, they have different types of practice, and the students can see the level of difficulty. It's indicated by the green flashes. So, for example, set 1 is it's the basic level, and then it covers all of the different types of diagrams that the students might be asked to write about in IELTS Writing Task 1, with specific exercises focusing on, so here we have a chart, then we have a model answer, and it's focusing on ways of expressing numbers as quarters or as age groups, 1 in 5 or 20%, so that the students develop the flexibility of the language that they need and also see what the exam's asking for. And finally, we have the test practice. And here there are practice tests for IELTS that the students can download. For the writing, they have to download it. They can't do it online. Obviously, for the listening, they have a choice whether they want to download it or whether they want to do it online. So they can work on paper or they can work directly on the computer. Again, the flexibility, because how many people have a printer at home? I'm not sure. And I also think that as someone who's kind of been preparing students for IELTS for a number of years, I really don't like spending my limited class time making them sit practice tests. If there's an option for them to do that in their own time, come back to the class with the problems perhaps that they might have had, which we can then work on. And rather than, spending half an hour in a 1 or 1.5 hour lesson with them just doing a test. So I think these resources allow us to free up class time to focus on what's needed. That's not the only thing that we've got. So that's a very quick overview of the road to IELTS. And I'd now like to just talk a little bit to you about some of the other resources that are available. The first one is the British Council's own Take IELTS website. Now, here, the students can find a lot of very useful information for them. They can find out, they can book their test, but they can also understand the format of the test. There are more free practice tests, so even if your students haven't registered for IELTS and don't have access to Road to IELTS, there are also practice tests on the Take IELTS website. And there are also something that I particularly like is the tips for the exam day. Now, these are tips from candidates who've taken the test. And it may be different in India, but I must say in France, students are not always ready to take the advice of the teacher. They're more likely to respond well to tips from people of their own age group or people who've actually been through the experience of taking the test. So here they have lovely videos from IELTS candidates who give advice to other IELTS candidates about how they should prepare for the different papers. They've also got more sort of detailed information. For example, this is the one about the listening test. So it explains to them what the test's going to be like, how many texts they will hear, and the purpose of it, and things like that. So that, because the better that the students understand the test itself, what's required and what it's testing, the better they're going to be able to reach up and do what they have to do. Then there's tips for each paper there, and again the practice tests. Moving on, something that I particularly like, which is another free resource which is given to IELTS candidates when they register. They get free access to Word Ready. Now, Word Ready is something to help them build their academic vocabulary, because IELTS is a test of academic English, or the academic module is, and it's used by students to access higher education in English. But if you're studying at university, you might have very good general English, but you might, if you're not a native speaker of English, and even if you are, you might not have the academic vocabulary that you're going to come across when you start your university studies. So this software, or which has been built into an app, is built around the academic word list, which is Avril Coxhead's corpus of the most common words in academic English. So it's going to help the students not only in the test, but also when they actually get to university. So let me explain a little bit about how it works. First of all, it's preloaded with IELTS texts when the students log on and put the app on their smartphones, which of course they all have. And basically it starts off with the students looking at specifically academic vocabulary, and they're given a set of definitions of the word that's being focused on, and they're being asked to choose the correct definition for that word in that context. And the nice thing about Word Ready is that it keeps a track of the words that the students already know. Those are the ones in green. The words that they are in the process of learning, and the new words which they perhaps didn't guess the correct definition at the time. But also the students, if you can see here, they have the option to select the words that they want to learn at the moment. They can choose, they can move the words into the Learn Later section. So again, it's about giving the students the autonomy to choose what they want to, what they think they need. Then, I mean, you have a lot of information about the words, what part of speech it is, how you pronounce it, and a lot of different example sentences with the word in context, because as we all know, it's no good learning a word if you don't know how to use it. Then it moves on to matching the words that they're focusing on that time with the correct definition of the word. And finally, it asks them to put the words back into the original text that they started from. And the good thing, I mean, Word Ready is already loaded with some IELTS type texts, but the students also have the option to copy and paste other texts, other academic texts presumably, into the system and work with their own texts. And for the teachers, the teacher can also select a text that they think would be useful for their students to work on. It's, you know, relevant to the exam. It's got vocabulary that's perhaps relevant to their subject area. And so you could suggest text to your students and ask them to paste that particular text into this application, then you know that all your students have looked at the same thing. They've all hopefully learned those words. Then when they come back into class, you can use that as a focus to whether you're doing other sort of exercises to reinforce vocabulary or quick vocabulary game at the end of the lesson. And here finally you can see they have to drag and drop the words back into the text. So it's gone through the stages of recognizing the word, then some exercises with the word, and finally they're being asked to produce the word, which kind of fits with how we think we learn vocabulary. I'd also like to say to you this, that you should encourage your students, if they're going to take IELTS or might need to take IELTS in the future, there's a free British Council app. Sorry, the IELTS app, IELTS Word Power, which again can be downloaded onto a phone, and so they can practice vocabulary, comprehension and listening skills. And this is compatible, I know, with Android, BlackBerry and Nokia devices, and hopefully with a lot more by this point. And if it isn't, let us know and we'll make it compatible. Also, other resources for IELTS, the British Council's Learn English website also has an IELTS section which you could send your students to and ask them to look at specific exercises and come back. Learn English Teens has some very good general advice for young people who are taking exams, and of course there are a number of other British Council mobile apps. And finally, because we're teachers and because we love resources, from the Take IELTS website, up at the top, you will find a tab which says For Teachers, and this has a lot of useful information for teachers. It has IELTS teaching resources which are free for you to download and use in your classes. It has some information about the criteria which are being used to assess the students in IELTS, and this is aimed at teachers, not at students. There's something similar but at a different level for the candidates on their part of the site. On the teacher's site, you can read and print off copies of the assessment criteria so that you can help your students to understand what they're being assessed on. And there's also a place where you can get answers to your questions. I'd like to stop there and take questions and comments from the audience at this point, if that's possible.
Is there, excuse me, I'm Pushpa from Chennai. Is there any site which helps the students to take a mock test and check their band?
Yes, on both, they can take mock tests on the Road to IELTS, but also on the Take IELTS website, which I have. Okay, so I've got the Teach IELTS website. It's basically the same address. So it's this Take IELTS website. There are free tests there for the candidates, listening tests, reading tests, which they can actually take, and they get a score, and then there's information that tells them what that score relates to as a band score. Obviously, for the speaking test, that's not possible. But for the writing test, again, they don't actually get some kind of band score, but they can see sample questions, they can see model answers. But that's where we as teachers we're still needed.
Ma'am, I've seen that. Excuse me.
I can hear you, but I couldn't see you. Sorry.
The actors test, is there anything to do with IELTS, Is it a miniature form of IELTS, this actors?
No. IELTS is a test which is has 3 partners. That's the British Council, IDP, IELTS Australia, and the University of Cambridge ESOL, or Cambridge English Language Assessment. And IELTS is a test for students who want to access higher education in English, or the general training version is used for immigration purposes to English-speaking countries like Canada. APTIS is a different type of test, and I believe that my colleague Gwen will be talking about APTIS. APTIS is the British Council's own test, and it's used for testing the level of large groups of people. It's not a certificated test, if you like. So this IELTS test is an internationally recognized certificate of the candidate or test taker's level of English. APTIS is used, for example, by ministries of education or other government ministries to assess the level of their employees, or it could be used by a university to assess the level of their students in order to put them into slightly less mixed ability classes.
Yeah, that's right. But Kerala government is doing that, for the students over there.
They're using APTIS, are they?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Can you raise your hands, please? So I have 2 colleagues there. Gentlemen, okay, the lady there first.
Do you have a page where you display the recent questions that were asked in the recent IELTS exams in various countries?
No, you don't, because a lot of decisions are being made on the basis of IELTS. So decisions about who gets the place at Harvard, who gets the place at the University of Cambridge. So IELTS is a test whereby security is very important because it's a very high stakes test. So I know that Cambridge English Language Assessment have a very large item bank of test questions, but those are secure because it takes them about 2 years to develop a single IELTS question, because they trial them all over the world to make sure that there's no cultural bias in it, so that it's not going to be easier for French people than it is for Singaporean people, for example. So the questions themselves are secure, and no, they're not put out in the public domain. If you want to look at types of IELTS questions on our sites, there are some, and there's also books of IELTS past papers like Cambridge University Press IELTS test books that tells you what the questions were, but you can't find out what the questions are because it wouldn't be a fair test if that was the case.
Thank you. The gentleman there. Maybe.
I'm Sunil from Maharashtra. I want to ask a question. Are there any scholarship opportunities for taking this type of exam?
I think I might have to pass that question over.
Yeah. There is an IELTS scholarship that the British Council gives to 8 candidates every year. So candidates who have taken the test with the British Council and they may be going for further studies anywhere in the world, they can apply for those 8 scholarships, which gives them 300,000 rupees per scholarship, which they can use for their tuition fees. So there is a scholarship, annual scholarship for 8 candidates.
And I'd like to just add to that, there's also research bursaries available for people who want to do research, teachers usually, who want to do research into the IELTS test. And there's an annual research scholarship, or more than one, I believe, for IELTS. So if you'd like to do some research into IELTS, there is money available for that, and you would then be asked to publish your findings, because there's a whole, every year there's a book of the IELTS research reports that come out, and that's also quite interesting reading if you are interested in assessment, and that's available on the Ielts.org website, which is www.ielts.org.
Yeah, gentleman there.
Hi, this is Ahmed Pasha from Hyderabad. What's the difference between CPE, Cambridge Proficiency in English, and IELTS?
Thanks for the question. So I think you've got to think about it in two ways. The first thing is that the CPE exam is part of a suite of exams which are at specific CEFR levels. So proficiency is a C2 level of English. CAE is C1, FCE is B2, PET is B1. Now the Ielts tests across the whole level of English ability, because it has a 9-band score which goes from 0, you didn't turn up, 1, you have almost no knowledge of English, to IELTS 9, you are, to all intents and purposes, equivalent to a native speaker. You are able to operate, you're perfectly competent in English, whether or not it's your first language or your second language or your third language. That's one difference. So the CPE is at a specific level, and if you're not at C2 and you take CPE, you probably won't get a certificate. If you're at C1, you'll get something that says you're at C1. The other, another difference is the way that it's used, because the main suite Cambridge exams provide a framework for people who are studying English. They take FCE when they're in France. They tend to take FCE when they're about 16. Then they might take CAE at 18 or 19, and then finally take CPE if they carry on that far. So they're kind of milestones in somebody's English language learning career path, if you like, and they are valid for the whole of your life. Whereas IELTS is a specific test, which I would say you don't take IELTS unless somebody's asked you for an IELTS band score for a specific reason, because the IELTS is usually valid for 2 years, because the idea being that if you don't speak English for 2 years, if you don't use it, you lose it. It's possible that your level has actually gone down. So the universities will ask for an IELTS test, usually from the last 2 years. So CPE is something then that you would do to put on your CV, whereas IELTS you would do it because you're either planning to emigrate to Canada, or you're trying to access either undergraduate, master's, or higher level education in English medium.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yeah, gentleman here in the middle row.
Hi ma'am, for a novice teacher whose level of English is at C1, so how long does it take to become an IELTS trainer? Supposedly the teacher has C1 level.
It really depends on the IELTS score that your students need. If you're at a C1, then you could help students get to C1. Do you see what I mean? And if they perhaps need IELTS 6 for immigration purposes, you could definitely help them. Yeah? So I think you've got to think, if you're C1, you can definitely help your students to get B2. The thing is, most students who take IELTS, and there were 2 million last year, the majority, over 70%, are using it to access higher education, and the universities are usually asking for a minimum of 6.5, which is on the B2, C1, somewhere there between the two. And the more prestigious the university, or the more challenging the course, the higher level course, the higher band score that's going to be asked for. Does that answer your question? In order to help students with the test, I would say you need to be familiar with it. I know years ago when we first started offering IELTS courses, all of the teachers had to take IELTS, because the best way to really understand that test is to have been through it yourself. I don't think there's a specific time. I think if you can familiarise yourself with the test. I know that the British Council here in India also offers teacher training courses for IELTS teachers.
Yeah, we do. There's a teacher training course that is conducted by the British Council across the country. So if you are interested, do contact the council office nearest to you, and they'll give you the schedule in the year as to when the next one is being conducted. Can we have the gentleman next to him ask the question?
Ma'am, which of these online resources are free and which of them are to be paid for?
The Take IELTS website is free. The Teach IELTS website is free. The app, the IELTS Word Power app, is free. The other ones, for example, Road to IELTS, 10 hours of it is free on the website, and 30 hours of it is given free to all candidates. The only thing that's paid for, and it's not, I don't think it's particularly expensive, it's is the institutional version, the 120 hours, which some institutions choose to buy for all of their students, which gives them 120 hours access plus learner tracking, and that you have to pay for, but the rest is you don't pay for it. They're there, so we want you to use them, and we want you to encourage your students to use them.
Okay, we'll just take last two questions. The lady here in the middle.
Good afternoon. My question is about writing tests of IELTS. As we know, there are models for writing tests. If the student wants to narrate it in his own way, will the answer be accepted, and what are the criteria for assessment for writing tests?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? So there are models, but they want to answer in a different way. Have I understood correctly?
Yes, there are in preparation for writing IELTS. There are models that for students. In most cases, the students they will write in this model, in writing test. Will their answer be accepted if they narrate in their own way? The answer will be accepted. And what are the criteria for assessment of writing tests?
Okay, so they're not expected to write the same thing as the model, obviously. There are two writing tasks in IELTS. I would say that task one, it's very important that the students understand what's required, and to put it into a context, it's like the body of a research report. They are asked in task one to describe the information. So that means they should describe the information, they should include the figures. And it's based on the university corpus, so this is a very common form of writing, particularly at master's or PhD level, where you do some research and you write up your research. So in task one, I would say it's more prescriptive. For task two, it's a discursive essay. So in task two, they're being asked to come up with their own ideas, their own opinions, to structure them logically, to support them. So that's a much more personal task. In terms of the assessment criteria, they're on the website. You can look at them, you can download and print them. There are different criteria for marking task one and task two. Okay, so task one, less flexibility. They must produce the type of writing that's asked for, because the IELTS writing test tests the two most common forms of writing at university. And depending on the subject area of your students, you'll find if you have engineers and science students, they will find task one easier. And if you have arts and humanities students, they'll be much more comfortable with task two. That's my experience.
Thank you. One last question, if anyone has. Gentleman here in the front row.
I'm Srinivas from Hyderabad. There's a general saying, like from the students, when I interact with the student, they say that we have British Council conducting the IELTS examination as well as IDP. Somehow people say that no, IDP testing will be a little bit easier when compared to British Council. That's the reason we'd like to opt for IDP. Can you give me clarification, like what is the testing process, how the evaluation happens? At the higher level, can you give clarity about this? Thank you.
I think it's just an urban myth. My understanding of Ielts is that it's all very, very strictly controlled. The security, because it's a high-stakes test. IDP and the British Council are partners with Cambridge English Language Assessment in Ielts, and as far as I'm aware, there is absolutely no difference. I'm assuming that it's an urban myth. Yeah, because the procedures in Ielts are very strict. There's no room for IDP to do it differently or the British Council to do it differently. It's all standardised, not only across India, but across the whole world, because it needs to be, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair. It has to be fair to the students, because there's so much riding on it.
Thank you, Louisa. I think there will be a lot of questions which people have, which we've not been able to answer, but you're there for the next 2 days, and during the coffee breaks, I think people can approach you and get answers to their questions. Thank you very much for coming here. It's been a very interesting, interactive, and informative session. So thank you very much. And as a token of our appreciation, just a small gift to you.
Well, thank you, Vivek, and thank you to all of you for still being here at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Should be congratulating yourselves.